Well, well, hello. Sorry to come in coughing, gentle listeners. Um, Something in the air today, it appears. Actually, there is. I don't know if you knew this, Jim, but Canada is sending down something real nasty from the skies here in Wisconsin. It
Yes.
was real gross out yesterday. But anyways, sunshine and rainbows right now because we're here with Professor Matt, and we're going to finish our series on Sellars. We've been kind of chipping away at this for a little bit, and you've got,
Yeah.
what is it, a 6-part Substack series now?
Seven. Seven.
Oh, woo.
I went all the way, man. All
Yeah,
the way.
that's, and I'm sure it is sufficient for a book, and maybe it will become one at some point.
Yeah.
But we're going to give the executive summary and wrap up today, and then of course we'll encourage people to go read the entire Substack if they want all the finer details. But yeah,
Details. Yeah, I mean, we had originally planned to do a 7-part series on the show here on the Sellars, but I think that would have outdistanced even our stamina, right? But I did in fact write a 7 part Substack on this thing, right? So I think Sellars' original essay is like 30 some pages, and I think my total Substack, if I put it in a Word file, would come out to like 140 pages, right? So
don't you love it, man? That's what it's all about.
Yeah. But as I mentioned before, I essentially wrote my master's thesis on this, right? And so it was very cool to go back over much the same material 25 years after the fact, right?
Yeah.
And kind of like it was a good chance to redo. Yeah.
I'm linking the Substack in the comments here so people can
so
be sure to subscribe to that as well. So before we do our wrap up, should we do a wrap up of all the things that we've done so far? You know, just to remind the good people.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah, and one thing I want to say too is that I think the value of spending time with Sellars' philosophy and the scientific image of man is, like, as we'll see, he comes to no actual concrete conclusion. This thing, it's like mainly philosophical geography. He's mapping a field for you.
Yeah.
Okay. But I think if you're going to understand what the philosophy of mind really is, and like what the real issues in the philosophy of mind are, and like what a lot of the terms really mean that get thrown around in there, I think there's no better place to begin than philosophy and scientific image of man. Okay. Mm-hmm. And I really encourage our listeners and viewers, this, whether you do it through my Substack or you do it through a direct reading of Sellars' essay, ideally both, right? Okay, or other commentaries on this out there, is to spend some time with this, because I think a lot of what goes on in more popular discussions of philosophy of mind, and even in some like academic discussions of it, are just really, they're missing what the big point is here, and they're missing what the big issues are here, and it's going on fairly superficially, right? And so I would encourage people to actually get into something like Sellars' essay, because it connects it to these existential big ticket questions and stuff like that.
Yep.
And also it's, if you want to actually fairly see the case for either position in the philosophy of mind, this is a great place to go.
Yeah. I don't want to take any credit that's not deserved, which I'm sure is none, but was it our prompting you on this channel to do an intro to philosophy of mind that ultimately produced this enormous,
I said it on the air, it was like, someone prompted me for it, and when I thought about it, I said, look, really, if I were to introduce someone to philosophy of mind today, right now, I would take them through Sellars' philosophy and the scientific image of man. And I thought, well, then damn it, why don't I do that? Right. And so,
here we go.
So if you ask
me, a comfy seat. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if you ask me for an introduction to philosophy of mind today, I would say here it is. It would be a very careful read of Sellars' essay, right? And I think this will become like an introductory book to the philosophy of mind.
Yeah, I hope so, man. This is really cool stuff. So yeah, let's dive in. Let's do the wrap up before the wrap up, if that's okay. That's cool. So it's been a minute since our last episode.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So what is Sellars up to in this? So Sellars, makes the case that early on, so there's a meta philosophy. There's an introduction to philosophy in this introduction to philosophy of mind, and he says, what philosophy is the critical, reflective understanding of how things in the broadest sense of things hang together in the broadest sense of hangs together, right? And he says, but really, so in critical reflective here is important, because he says the distinctively human way of doing something isn't just to do it, but to put our doing of it into question. Okay, so we don't just, as he says, know our way around the world. We ask ourselves, yeah, but why do we get around this way? Why is that the good way to do it? Why is that the best way to do it? Okay, so there's always a secondary reflection for Sellars, right? And he thinks once you start doing that, though, you're going to see that when it comes to what he calls man in the world, okay, our broadest understanding of ourselves hanging together with our broadest understanding of the world, there's two games in town. There's what he calls the manifest image and the scientific image. Okay. And he thinks it's always been this, right? And I think he has in mind here Plato's Phaedo, where you have Socrates at one point say, when I was young, I had this natural scientific view of the world, and that's all well and good. I think it's complete in its own right. But then now I have this other view of the world that's primarily in terms of my agency, my ability to think through concepts, my ability to act for reasons. And he doesn't see them squaring up too terribly well, right? And ultimately, but he affirms the priority, the primacy, the ungive up ability of that latter image, what Sellars calls the manifest image. Okay, and so for Sellars, really all of philosophy is this question: like, okay, which of these issues? How do we have a view of the whole that includes both the scientific image and the manifest image? And in doing so, it seems like we're going to have to prioritize one over the other. So which one is going to be the prioritized one, and thereby be the explanatory category of the other? Okay.
Right. Mm-hmm.
All right.
Great. Now, great summary. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so where he comes to in the essay, in one of the most pivotal moments, he basically says there's three possible positions you can have. Okay. One, he says you can re-identify things in the manifest image as things in the scientific image. Okay, so it turns out what we perceive as ordinary material objects just are, in some sense of just are, collections of electrons at various levels of organization.
We're going way back, just triangles, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, if you go to, and actually, you're kind of referring there to Timaeus, and I think
that's right. Yeah,
you do.
I'm a big fan of triangle theory, my friend.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, but I mean, I think you're
picking up triangles in the right way. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Plato introduces the problem of the two images in the Phaedo, and I think you get his answer to it in Timaeus.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And his answer to it is very curious. Right. Okay. So basically what Sellars has in mind there in that first option are your standard forms of reductionism or supervenience or what have you, that all of which are going to say, yeah, we've got things that we talk about in our manifest image of ourselves, our thoughts, our sensations, our standing as persons. And we're not going to say those aren't real. We're going to say they turn out to be these other things that we now can describe better in the scientific image. Okay. So the analogies might be like, as water is to H2O, a sensation or a thought is to a certain set of neurological processes or something like that.
Yep.
Okay. Or that would be a more straightforwardly a type identity reduction. In sort of looser kinds of non-reductive reductivism, right? Supervenience views, as the statue is to the configuration of clay, a thought or a sensation is to a certain collection of neurophysiological processes, what have you. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Now, and in the Substack, I get into all the gory details of that. Okay. So, but that's option one. Okay. I call it accommodationism. All right. Because what you're saying there is the manifest image can be accommodated. There is room for it in the scientific image.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But with this caveat, the scientific image is running the show, right? It's not that we're re-identifying the scientific image in the manifest image. We're re-identifying the manifest image in the scientific image. Okay?
Yes, right.
And we'll explain why Sellars thinks that would be the way it would go later. Okay, now. Second option, Sellars says, is to say, it turns out the manifest image is the real one. Okay. And the scientific image is just an abstraction of things in the manifest image. So talk of electrons, talk of, photons, talk of all these theoretical entities that we have in the sciences are simply shorthand ways of talking about the quantitative and nomological attributes of things in the manifest image. Okay. Mm-hmm. So on this view, the table is the real thing. Okay. And then the talk of the electrons that compose the table is just shorthand for talking about the table under certain experimental conditions.
Mm-hmm.
The broadly kind of like, and you can see this kind of view in like maybe most famous in contemporary philosophy is Bas van Frassen's.
I was going to say von Frassen's anti-realism, stuff like that. Yeah.
And he wrote a book called The Scientific Image, right? So he's like,
Mm-hmm.
he was in dialogue with Sellars about this, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you also see this, and this is more interesting for me, in phenomenologists like Husserl, right? Phenomenologists like the early Heidegger, phenomenologists like Merleau-Ponty, all of who are going to say the world of ordinary perception has a kind of ontological priority over anything that we would posit theoretically behind it.
Sure.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another option. Okay. Sellars is just in philosophy and scientific man, not prepared to take that seriously. Okay. Mm-hmm. Like he says elsewhere, science is the measure of all things that they are, that they are, that they are not, that they are not.
So, yeah, sort of. That's a motto
for you, right? You're going to like, so for him, that is the position to be avoided at all costs. Okay. Now, and it's, I want to be careful because like he's not being unfair. Like when you see how the essay unfolds. Okay. But for him, he would prefer not to go that route.
Real quick, what's your pulse on anti-realism today? I mean, I literally just read a paper from somebody. It was an interesting one, further developing that Darwin's dilemma, but instead of against moral realism, against scientific realism. Yeah. And it does seem to me that anti-realism, though it's a minority, scientific anti-realism, is gaining some steam.
I mean, I think when you have people like, what's his name? Kind of science guy who just wrote that book on if you take a Darwinian stance, like scientific realism is over.
That was exactly what this paper was about.
Don Hoffman.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But that, not the author of this paper. If anyone, real quick, if you want the paper, I literally had it up. Just let me. An Evolutionary Skeptical Challenge to Scientific Realism. And the author was Christophe de Ray. So people want to check it out. Found it a fascinating read. Anyways, continue. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And there's also like, okay, so I think, I mean, I guess if you made me bet a paycheck on it right now, I would probably be identified as a scientific realist, right? Like, and also like other people, they should come up for people like Michael Dummett, right? Okay. But really, I think there's also some interesting.
And I like a lot of Dummett stuff, but he's quirky in a lot of ways, dude.
Yeah.
You know, he was the big influence on my dude, Barry Miller. Miller loved Dummett.
Yeah.
Hugely.
And also Dummett had like all sorts of cool books on like tarot cards too. Right? So. he had a famous paper on transubstantiation too. But anyway, but there's also like I've recently become very enamored with a recently late French philosopher and history of science guy, Bruno Latour, and he has some fascinating middle positions to look at between like a crass scientific realism and a crass scientific anti-realism. So I throw Latour out there as a possible other option.
Right, that there are some sort of middle ground positions. And actually, in fact, the paper I just read highlighted some of those, saying, hey, if you hold these sort of middle-ish ground positions, then you probably aren't going to be too bothered by the stuff I have to say in this paper right now.
And I think actually in some ways Latour is a candidate for the foil I'm going to use with Sellars in the book that I'm going to look at. But anyway. But that's an aside. Okay, so third possible option is to say, no, the manifest image is merely an illusion, right? Okay. And the real story is the scientific image. Okay. And so here specifically, like, you know, ordinary material objects, thoughts, sensations, these are mere appearances, right? And not descriptions of how things are in themselves. And the real story is just a physical story. Okay. And this is where you get like later people, you know, who were directly influenced by Sellars, people like the Churchlands, right? Okay. Richard Rorty, people I don't realize, like early in his career, Richard Rorty was like a hardcore limited materialist, right? I'm not sure he ever really backed off that, right? And so like that's a strand like you get that can come out of Sellars. Okay.
Yeah.
I think you're seeing like all three of these positions. So you have Bas van Frassen is, you know, like at least dialectically very influenced by Sellars. And like he goes the route of what I call manifest exclusivism, right? The exclusive story ontologically is the manifest image. You've got people who are going to go the what I call the scientific exclusivism, right? The Churchlands, early Rorty, like you get, what's the guy's name? Keith Frankish, the illusionist.
Yes.
Guy. I'm not sure. I haven't really read his stuff, but so I don't know if he cites Sellars as an influence here, but that can be this, right? And then you have, straight, traditional reductionists, and you can see influence from Sellars there. All right.
So where would Sellars, where would he park structural realists, for example?
Give me an example.
Like Russell, right? That, physics is it's capturing something real, but doesn't exhaust the whole picture type of deal, right?
Yeah. So Sellars, Sellars himself thinks there is a completed science to be had. Okay. It might be that we can't get to it. Like we'll approach it asymptotically, right? Okay.
Sure.
He thinks there is a completed story. Okay.
And that will complete the story.
Yeah. Whether we'll get to it is always a question. Okay.
Sure. Yeah. I think the structural realists, at least the epistemic structural realists, would want to say, no, it's what it captures is definitely the analogy that's sometimes used is like, it's like a metal detector. It's picking up real things, but doesn't mean plastic doesn't exist, right?
Yeah.
And we just shouldn't expect it to pick up everything and tell us everything, right?
Right. Okay. So now in terms of like, what does Sellars do with this? Okay. An important point in the essay, he lays out he thinks what are the only three options available, right? And I think there's a case to be made for this. All right. And we can subdivide all sorts of things inside the three options, right? So you've got accommodationism, manifest exclusivism, and scientific exclusivism. These are my terms on Sellars. And he takes in an earlier section though, he made this point, and it's really important to understand what goes after this, is there's a worry whether or not there really is a single scientific image at all. Okay, because you've got biochemistry, you've got chemistry, you've got physics, you've got Darwinian biology, you've got sociology, psychology, right? All these things, they have their own methods, right? They have their own claims. They discover laws that don't necessarily map onto each other very neatly. So in what sense can we say there's a single scientific image at all?
Are we doing with a hierarchy or a quilt, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And Sellars is the least quilt guy you could find. Like he thinks because he's a good Hegelian at the end of the day, like the world is intelligible. Okay. All right. And so the way he deals with that, he says, well, okay, he thinks there can be ontological unity perfectly consistently coupled with what I call access diversity. Okay. So he thinks, one and the same set of entities can be accessed according to different methods.
Sure.
Okay. And so he thinks what physics does is it finds out the entities we're dealing with. Okay. And so the physics discovers the quarks and the electrons and all this. Okay. And in the broadest possible sets of laws. Okay. But then does that mean though that like biochemistry, because it doesn't directly refer to those things, okay, and you could maybe even be ignorant of those things and do biochemistry, does that mean that like biochemistry is like some independent separate science, right? And Sellars says, no, not necessarily at all. It just could be that at certain levels of organization, you discover different types of laws that operate there,
sure,
right? And you use different experimental methods to discover those, but you're still talking about the same stuff at the level of physics. You see that? Yep. And so for Sellars, the unity of the scientific image is the ontological unity that you could have that still operates despite access diversity.
Sure. Does access, so is that compatible with a kind of hardball physicalism, or do you have to be a little bit softer on that? Because it sounds like we can have these sort of systems level properties and laws, right?
Okay, so Sellars seems to like the more softball version, right? Because he's happy to say, look, it could be that at the level of biochemical system, like you've got an entirely different access here. And if you didn't approach this as biochemist, you wouldn't know what was going on.
You're just not going to know, right? Yeah.
Not going to know. Yeah. And Sellars does think you're going to always have a knowledge reality fit that's got to like be part of this, right? And so it must be that there are features at the level of those systems that you're getting. Okay. But systems of what? Systems of the basic physical objects.
Yeah.
Right. And so,
by the way, that seems that would fit, I think, pretty well with the Aristotelian hylomorphic type of view, right?
Here's the difference, though. Okay, so the Aristotelian actually have a footnote about this, and I think this is one of the contact points for argument, right?
Yeah,
I have a footnote in the essays. The Aristotelian says where you have, like the Aristotelians would say, access diversity does not come without ontological expense, right? Okay, so if biochemical
I see what you're
things,
saying. Yeah.
if biochemical things are doing a thing that their parts don't do, then they're a thing in their own right.
We got substance priority there, right?
Yeah. Okay. Now,
yes.
the thing is, okay, that's a huge question, right? And it's probably going to come down to like first principle kind of stuff. But the whole argument of physics books too is basically to say you don't get access diversity for free without some ontology.
And that just seems damn right to me. But we'll save that for another day, right? Yeah.
But I agree, but I don't know how to argue it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Yeah. Okay.
Right. Yeah. I think you're right. That's going to come down to much deeper.
Yeah. But I think that's like one of your put your foot down issues one way or another. Like, does diversity entail ontology?
That is actually a really good point to bring up of where the contact points or points of debate. I mean, it just seems right to me, right? That yes.
So if it doesn't, then like psychophysical reductionism even has got a big bump now. Right? Okay, because the point is like, look, yeah, sure, like you don't talk about liquidity at the level of the quarks and the leptons, right? Or right. But that's just to say we access water from a different angle than you might when you're doing physics. Do you see what I mean? Okay. And so then look, you don't get thoughts and sensations at the level of quarks and leptons, but then like someone might argue, well, yeah, but because we're using a different method when we do psychology, right? And that's where the discussion goes for Sellars is like, okay, could we then say that psychology is just an access diverse science from physics, from chemistry, from biochemistry, from biology, right? And he basically says, look, guys, if you're going to like get away with some kind of psychophysical reduction or supervenience, that's what you're going to have to show. Right? And he just like kicks it out there. Okay, now going back forward a little bit. He then argues, okay, so we got our three positions. You got accommodationism, which is basically to say you've got unity of ontology but access diversity. Right?
Got it.
You've got scientific exclusivism, which says, or manifest exclusivism that says, real world is the world of ordinary perception and ordinary introspection, and then science is an abstraction of that for practical purposes.
We've got some useful fictions type of deal.
We've got some useful fictions. And then scientific exclusivism says just the opposite. The real world is the world of scientific objects, and then we have a bunch of useful fictions that is the perceptual world and our introspective world.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, Sellars first off says, I don't think accommodationism is a starter at all, or it's got a problem. Okay. And interestingly, he goes to what I think is like the best version of the qualia problem that anyone's ever come up with. Okay. So he says, okay, because like what happens is people now, we just say, like we say the magic incantation that qualia are irreducible, and then we move on. Okay, right? Sellars has an interesting kind of argument for this, though. Okay, because he says, look, he has this famous example of pink ice cubes, right? So I guess like in the 60s, the thing was like make your cocktails with pink ice cubes, right? And I've heard
I can see this.
A bit of a boozer, I guess, right? Anyway, so like people always love to talk about Sellars and his pink ice cubes. He says like, but the point is you
know what's going to be in my drink next episode.
Exactly right. Pink ice cubes, right? I of course when I was doing this Googled pink ice cube. There's all sorts of different recipes for pink ice cubes.
I'm like super curious now. You've totally lost my interest in the larger topic. I'm just saying how to make pink ice cubes.
Anyway, so he says, look, when you perceive the pink ice cube, okay, the pink, he says, has what he calls an ultimate homogeneity. Okay, all the parts of pink are pink. Like no matter how much you divide the pink, you end up with pink parts. Okay. But he says every physical thing upon division, you end up with something different. You see what he's up to there, right? So for Sellars, what makes qualia intractable, it makes them unidentifiable as anything physical, is they are ultimately homogeneous, whereas you don't get ultimate homogeneity in anything physical. Right? It's either breakable or it ends up being particulate, right?
Yes.
And he's saying there's nothing particulate or breakable in pink as pink.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. And Sellars takes this argument super, super ass seriously. Like he trucks it out later in the essay at a really important juncture. Okay. So he says, yeah, you got a problem here sensations now, okay, such that you can't, he thinks, then accommodate them into a reductive or emergentist story about physical reality. Okay, so now you only got two options. It's either manifest exclusivism or scientific exclusivism. Okay.
Yeah. Right.
So now what? So he says, enter the scientific exclusivist. Okay, so your perception of the ultimate homogeneity of the pink ice cubes, right, or the pink in the ice cubes, it's an illusion. It's not real. It's not the real story. Okay. And then Sellars, now he says, okay, let's talk about our boy Descartes, right? Okay. And he says, the Cartesian comes along and we'll point out, okay, maybe we'll grant you this. The world in itself isn't pink, but I still am appeared to pinkly. Mm-hmm. And I can't deny that I am appeared to pinkly. Okay. And the appearance has to have an ontology.
It's got to be somewhere, right?
Mm-hmm. Got to be somewhere. Yeah. Somewhere. Okay. Ergo, the move, and so like the Sellarsian version of the cogito is, I'm appeared to, therefore I'm appeared to, right? Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? I'm appeared to, therefore there are appearances, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so then he says the move has got to be, you're going to have to say there is a realm of where the appearances go on, and then you've got your physical realm, and now you got dualism.
You got dualism, right? Yeah. There are appearances, I think, is a better starting point if you want to go Cartesian, right? Yeah. Uh-huh.
Right. And this is how he reads Descartes. And then Sellars says, but same thing for thoughts. He's like, look, you can't, even if you want to say thoughts are reducible to something, okay, you still can't deny that there is an appearance to thinking. Okay. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So it's interesting for Sellars. This is going to be very important for understanding Sellars. The qualia problem, the hard problem, so-called, and the problem of cognition, the easy problem, so-called, they are stuck together.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you can't divide them up so neatly. So then he says, so now it looks like you got to have a dualism of thoughts and sensations. Okay. And so this seems to be the only option now. Right. Now, then when he goes, he says dualism, as his student Robert Brandon puts it, to call something dualism is to say we don't have an intelligible account of it. Okay. So Sellars says, rather than dualism, the only option would be manifest exclusivism.
Yes.
All right. Because the manifest exclusivist doesn't have a problem accommodating appearances. Okay.
Yeah.
So at an important point, Sellars says, it looks like on pain of dualism, you're going to have to go manifest exclusivism.
Yeah. Yeah. So interesting. His the way you did immediately the qualia problem reminds me of Leibniz's mill argument, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Which I've always found like I know a lot of people kind of wave their hand at it, but I don't know, man. That's always struck me as like a pretty good one, actually.
In that section of philosophy of scientific image, he gives you the best history of the philosophy of mind from Descartes to Kant. Ever.
Yeah.
Without really telling you what's going on there, but all the players are there, right?
Yeah, like that totally is like, oh, that's just Leibniz's mill, more or less,
yeah.
right?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so that's really cool how we kind of where we wound up there. All right. Mm-hmm.
So it's funny. So at this point in the dialectic,
he's winner. Like so at first he's like, this position is yucky. We can't go there, but it seems we have to go there, right?
So it's like at this point, it's like, Husserl and Merleau-Ponty 1, Paul Churchill 0, right? You know what I mean? It's like
I like that he's just like ref or umpire or something.
Yeah, no, yeah, he's just umpiring this thing, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so
sort of like a narrative review of sorts, Mm-hmm.
It's exactly what it is. Sellars is a storyteller. Like you read all of this, he loves to tell stories.
Yes.
Doing genealogies. Okay.
Yeah.
So Sellars is like, okay, crap. Is it done then? And do we have to go with manifest? And he's like, maybe not so fast. Okay. Mm-hmm. All right. And so what he does is he basically divides the question. He's like, okay, so he's not backing off that you can't reduce qualia. He's like that. It's not happening. They have ultimate homogeneity. Qualitative states have ultimate homogeneity. Nothing in the scientific image has ultimate homogeneity. Ergo, qualia they're going to dangle. But the really important part of the manifest image is not our feeling, it's our thinking. And maybe if we divide and we look at what thinking really is, then we can get a reduction of that. And we could say, for all important purposes, we've got our synthesis into the scientific image. Mm-hmm. Okay. So he wants to, what he does, he changes it. He's like, well, maybe accommodation about sensation is no go, but maybe we could get accommodation about thought.
Okay. Which is like totally the opposite of the Aristotelian perspective, exactly. Right? Which is very funny. Yeah. Uh-huh.
And basically what he does is he trucks out like one of the earliest and I think interesting versions of functionalism. He says, well, wait, isn't what makes something a thought isn't how it feels. Okay. He says we understand thought on an analogy with language. Okay? And therefore, like what's important about thought is its position in a scheme of utterances, right?
That relates inputs and outputs and
inputs and outputs. Okay. So like what identifies language is it's sensitive to, like, I ask you questions, you can answer them, I can vary the context. Okay. So it's in a network it's an inferential network is what language is. The semantic syntactical network. Okay.
Yep.
And so Sellars says, well, so what's important about thoughts is it's not the qualitative part of it, even if it has a qualitative part, it's the semantical syntactical network part of it. Okay? Yeah. And he says, well, wait, maybe like these computer guys are going to start to discover, we can really get some sophisticated material, semantical syntactic networks going up. And then maybe the brain science guys are going to find an analogy between what's going on with the computer science guys and what's going on in the brain science that they're revealing. And then we can say, no, really what's going on here in thought is just neurophysiological.
Yeah.
Okay, so we can get a different kind of reduction. Okay.
Right.
And so Sellars says, all right, guys, go do it. Let's see if you can pull that off, right? It's all promissory note at that point. And, of course, the subsequent history of science has spoken well for this, right? Okay, now, but then he says, can't do it with thought, can't do it with sensations, and he goes back to the ultimate homogeneity argument. Right? Can't do it, won't work. And then he says, in a kind of a throw, he says, but also, look, in the human being, you cannot separate thinking from feeling in any neat way. Okay.
Right.
And therefore you're not going to be able to get your reduction of thought. All right. And once again, he goes like Husserl. He goes
taking
like
it back with the other hand. Right.
Yeah. Takes back the hands. Like, but wait, he just doesn't think the way we actually operate breaks the processes that neatly.
Yes. And I think that's totally correct.
Yeah. Okay. So it looks like, once again, the so-called easy problem doesn't get solved till you solve the hard problem.
Yeah, it's all hard.
It's all hard problem. Yeah,
it's all hard. Right.
So then this is really cool, and I didn't notice this until this reading of the essay. He then says, so the hope here is that science will come up with a model that puts ultimate homogeneity at the base of physical reality. And basically, it's panpsychism.
Or something near enough.
Something near enough. Yeah. Like he says, the only way this is going to work is if we can come up with a physical model that makes sense of this kind of qualitative ultimate homogeneity operate at the most basic physical level. And then you can start doing it. So then you could like pull off your functionalist stuff. Okay. So it's interesting. Like so people like the Strawson and Goff and they get the program. They really get the program. Right? Like that's if you're going to pull off the scientific understanding priority, you're going to have to build this in at the bottom.
Yeah.
Okay. Boom. Isn't that cool? Right.
It is cool. Right.
Yeah.
And, right. Yeah. A lot of thoughts on that. Right. One is like, how well does that actually fit with as many naturalists will complain, does that actually fit with the scientific image? Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Or, and this is why people like Goff, I think, get it. Because Goff is pretty keen to point out that like for this to be legit, it's going to have to be something that ends up being scientifically testable.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's a very Sellarsian move. Right. Yeah.
And that's one of the ongoing issues one has with certain frameworks, right? Is trying to identify what a natural thing or a natural cause is. Well, it's what science tells us about. Well, what does science tell us about natural things and natural causes? Thanks for helping.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So that brings us to the last section of the essay, which is like this like major bomb drop that Sellars does here. Okay, so
let's hear it. Drop it.
So he says, let's suppose we get like what I'm interpreting as like panpsychist-ish story. He's like, it still doesn't solve all the problems. Okay. It says because we're not just aware of ourselves as having thoughts and sensations, we're also aware of ourselves, as he says, persons. We're aware of ourselves as agents. Okay. We're aware of ourselves in the manifest image as we don't just have thoughts and sensations. We act either according to our thoughts and sensations or against our thoughts and sensations. He's making the point there, like there's a non-identity between, like we're not Humean clusters of thoughts and sensations.
Right.
We're agents that can act in light of those thoughts and sensations. How do I know that? Because I can run afoul of them. I can do what I didn't want to do, or I can do what I knew was the wrong thing to do.
Right. I can be like St. Paul. Right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so he says, so even if you gave me an account of thoughts and sensations, you haven't accounted for humans as persons, which is the real question for Sellars. Okay. And Sellars thinks there are two problems that come with this. There's kind of a standard free will problem. Okay. How is it that I can really have like libertarian type freedom here? Because and on that one, Sellars says, okay, Sellars, I think we can get a reconstruction of concepts somehow that like that's going to make that work out in a broadly satisfying compatibilist view. Okay.
Yeah.
He's just sort of hand waves there because I think for him, and I agree with him, that's the less interesting question. Okay? But he says, even leaving aside the free will question, there's this other question, okay, which is there is like I'll use my example we'll use Sellars' example of Jones, right? Okay. When I say Jones ought to do X, that is not the same thing as saying Jones did X, right? There's a different kind of description going on there.
Yes, of course.
There's what Jones ought to do, and there's what Jones did. Right. And these are not the same thing. Okay, so Sellars is admitting, do all the scientific description you want, you never get ought out of that. Okay.
Yeah, the classic gap, right?
Yeah, the classic gap. And I think this is let's go back, man. This is the gap that Plato's pointing out to in the Phaedo.
Yep.
Right. It's like he's come back to the Phaedo. Right.
Wasn't just Hume who came up with this, right?
No. Right. You know what I mean? Like, Plato's like, okay.
Aristotle, of course, and I think Aristotle actually solved it for the most part, right?
I mean, think of Plato's, with Socrates. That I was in the prison. You could give a complete description of me in the prison, but you didn't tell me why I ought to sit there, right?
Yes.
Or why I did because I ought to, right? All right. So Sellars basically says there's this important problem, right? That you've got like fundamental to the manifest image is that Jones is subject to ought and ought not does not show up in the scientific image whatsoever. Now, okay, you see that, all right? So for Sellars, this notion of normativity, that's the problem. And if you follow the Pittsburgh school following Sellars through McDowell, through Brandom, right? That is the question for them. Like this is what they worry about the most is like the status of normativity and how we make sense of it. Okay.
Yeah.
Sellars gives you a quick throwaway here. Okay. Right. So like he basically says like to say that Jones ought to do X is to say like Jones is a member of a community, like meaning if he's one of us, this is what he would do. Right. Okay. And you get some of that talk, which is interesting, but like I think what Sellars is up to is to say, look, he doesn't think ought can or needs an ontological analog because ought and is are not the same thing. Do you see that? So he thinks the synthesis between the manifest and the scientific image comes when we understand what we're doing in terms of the information that comes from the scientific worldview, but that doesn't tell us why we ought to do it. You see that? So for Sellars, where the synthesis comes is like you're not going to fold ought into is. You will not have it happen. It can't happen. Okay. But in as much as we base how we understand what we ought to do, not that ought we do it, but just what it is we would be doing on the scientific worldview, that is the synthesis that we can get.
Okay.
Right. So what the synthesis would be like Jones is fully informed scientifically. And the menu of options he has before him for action are those that are like specified by the scientific information. But then he decides what he ought to do.
Yeah,
he's a free agent.
Right. And to me, those are obviously important things to struggle with, as philosophers have forever. And immediately I think, well, dang, this is where the Aristotelian view I think is worth the ontological expense.
Yeah.
right? If you have a sort of substance priority, I think you can have the types of solutions that panpsychists are offering
Yeah.
without the difficulties that panpsychists continue to face, like binding problems and stuff like that, right?
So I think for like questions for sellers now is like
And it
one.
would seem like you'd be able to make kind of sellers kind of happy with that too,
Yeah.
maybe.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
I mean, when you read this essay, he's open to all this stuff. As you can see, he's
Yeah.
just like playing referee.
Right.
But I think like thing to ask is like, does ought really come without expense? It is. Interesting question, right? Okay. And moreover, like his students, like Brandom and McDowell, I think what like really where Sellers leaves us here is fairly Kantian, right? You got ought, you got is, you got two realms. Okay.
Yeah.
Though it depends how we read Kant, depends how we read Sellers. Okay, don't yell at me, don't hate me. Okay. But Brandom is going to come back and say, no, man, intelligibility is going to require that these two things get folded back into each other. So we're going to need this Hegelian synthesis to pull this off. Does that make sense? Right. And so like, so for me, the game in philosophy of mind now is, can like the Brandomian Hegelian synthesis happen? Okay. Or can we be satisfied just with phenomenological refinements of the manifest image?
Yeah.
You see that? Those to me are the only two games in town. It's either Hegel or it's like early Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, people like that.
And which direction do you favor or lean in?
I'm working on it, right?
Yeah. We're getting to the bottom of this, so stay tuned.
I like in thinking about thinking, which should be coming out sometime this year. I pretty much,
is that the title of the book, by the way?
Yeah.
Cool.
I pretty much take the refined phenomenological line.
Great. Yeah. Dude, this has been a baller episode. I really enjoyed this. And I of course rank everything according to my own personal satisfaction. Who cares what the audience says, right? But I've really enjoyed it. Now we appreciate you guys, and hopefully you guys got something out of this too. And I hope you guys, because I get it, there's lots of episodes with like fancy titles and hot, subjects and topics. But Jim, I gotta say, man, I just love these conversations so much. These kind of a little bit deeper dives into thinkers. This is where like we're just conversing, and really a lot of good stuff comes out. So if this is your first time catching a conversation between me and Jim on something like this, I get it. They might not seem as exciting on the surface, but I promise you, if you go back through the stuff we did on Aristotle and Plato, like it's always fun, man. It's always a blast.
And I would always ask, do you want excitement, or do you really want to understand things?
Yeah, right on. Like this is the stuff that matters, right? Get past like the surface level. Okay, this is what everybody's arguing about on Twitter, and like get down into the roots, right? Get down into the tall grass, right?
I think of what we just did there is we said, look, because if you go on Twitter or you go on whatever your social media platform is, and you look at people talking about philosophy of mind, it's going to be all about dualism versus materialism.
Yeah, right.
Right. And like, what did Sellers just say? Bitch, please. Right. Like, that's not the issue, right? The issue is actually manifest exclusivism, right, versus scientific exclusivism, right?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Or manifest exclusivism, I think, where we come out, versus Hegelian synthesis. That's where the real issue is, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Because like, even if you defend your dualism, Sellers would say, yeah, but okay, good luck, because now you've got a bifurcated view of reality, and we don't get ultimate intelligibility here, right? I know there's a lot of questions I'm begging there, right?
Yes.
But you know what I mean? And you go ahead and like get your reduction, but still you're gonna have other problems. Okay. So for him, like I think by really taking the time to understand, you understand like where the real issues are, and like how much of what you're reading and hearing and thinking about this is just noise, right? And you can like patiently actually look at the issue.
Yeah, absolutely, man. This has been great. Of course, I'm going to encourage everybody to go read your entire series over at Substack. Both of our Substacks are quite active, so if you guys aren't subbed up over there, please do so. It's just where more of the action happens. Philosophy for the people. Jim, anything else you want to announce or make known before we close this one out?
No, I don't think I'm gonna be coming up. My next Substack series is going to be on secularization.
All right. Yeah. Is that related to the talk that you recently gave?
Part one will be that talk, and then so part one will be on secularization and the Greek tragedy Antigone, and then part two will be on secularization and the Greek tragedy the Bacchae.
Oh, awesome. Yeah. So for people who don't know, Jim and I boy, that was like almost 2 months ago now. Presented at a conference, and they're actually, my understanding is they're going to turn that into a volume now. And they're going to put the papers out. So that should be pretty cool. Yep. But you're going to give a preview at least on your Substack of that. So awesome. Good. All right, guys, if you like what we're doing here, you can support us in the simple ways by liking, sharing, commenting, subscribing, and we will catch you on the next episode, my friends. See ya. Bye-bye.